All right, people are starting to come in. Let me turn on the captions actually. And I'll make sure people can chat with us. Hello, everyone. Welcome. As you're coming in, please let us know where you're tuning in from and or what brought you here this evening. Really great to know. What was your favorite toy growing up? I guess would be the question.
Sometimes if people just tell me their age, I can tell them what their favorite toy probably was.
Yeah. All right, so we're gonna go ahead and get started. Hi, I'm Omar Acevedo, and I'm the Literary Program Coordinator at the Mark Twain House and Museum in Hartford, Connecticut. And thank you so much for joining us for this virtual program for The He-Man Effect, How American Toymakers Sold You Your Childhood. First, I want to thank our sponsors. Our virtual programs are produced in part with support honoring the late Frank Lord. We are happy to honor his memory with these programs. And we are also incredibly grateful to the Wish You Well Foundation and Connecticut Public WNPR for supporting all of our virtual programs. If you're not a member, please consider supporting our museum by becoming a member. All members receive free admission to our author programs, the house and museum, year-round discounts in the store and cafe, and more. I'll put a link in the chat. And you can take a look at that whenever you'd like. Okay. Now on to our guests. Our author, Brian Box Brown, is an Eisner Award-winning author whose comics have appeared in the New York Times, Playboy, and New York Magazine. His books include the New York Times bestselling Andre the Giant, Life and Legend, Tetris, The Games People Play, Is This Guy for Real? The Unbelievable and Andy Kaufman, Cannabis, the Illegalization of Weed in America, Child Star, and Accidental Czar, which was written with writer Andrew S. Weiss. Our moderator, Alex Dubin, is a freelance writer specializing in comics and poetry, books, and art. And we encourage you to have a conversation in the chat. If you have a specific question, you can post that directly into our Q&A section that's on the bottom left. Please also know that you could click on captions to see live auto captioning of this event. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, I will be putting a link in the chat to purchase the He-Man Effect through our museum store. Your purchase will support our museum and our honored guest. So that is all from me. I will turn this over to Box and Alex. Please sit back and enjoy.
Okay. Well, thank you, Omar, for that introduction. But yeah, I mean, I guess just as a way to start, Box, I mean, we know you from your graphic biographies from Tetris, which is about the game, but also about how we think about games. And so I'm kind of curious sort of where this started exactly.
Where the nonfiction thing started?
Well, where the He-Man Effect started. I mean, I know we could go back to birth, and
yeah,
I mean,
sure.
We're the same age, and
sure.
Like, in some ways, the story of our childhood.
So, yeah, like a lot of times people ask me, like, how long did this take you to research? And the answer is like 15 years, because I like didn't realize that I was researching a book for 12 of those years. And then at some point I was like, oh, this part of the story, like there is a story here, because like I think forever I was just interested in He-Man and other toys of that era, like kind of somewhat unknowingly, just as like a nostalgic, I had this toy when I was a kid. I kind of would like to see it again. And it really started in that way, like totally organically. So like, I get sent to comic conventions and all over the country, and some of the big comic conventions, you know, there's always like a vintage toy contingent at those, right? So a lot of times you're at this big comic convention and you have to do an event at like, you have to do a signing at like 10 and an event at like 2:30. And so you're just like walking around the whole convention, checking it out. And then, you know, you come across like the He-Man and G.I. Joe and Transformers and old toys and stuff like that. And I was just like, you know, I just like started buying stuff that I wanted when I was a kid, and I would go home and look for stuff on eBay and all that stuff. And at some point, I realized like that there was like the feeling that I would get when I'd like look at these toys, or like even just look at them on eBay. I actually bought a Sears catalog on eBay from 1986, which was like almost as good. So like when I was a kid, I didn't really actually have like all the toys, you know what I mean? Like we didn't have like every toy, like we had like one or two toys, and like, but some other kids had like a bunch of the ones that you didn't have. And sometimes it was just nobody, it was just a commercial that you saw and you coveted it so bad. And so like, but also you can't really pick and choose what things bring on nostalgia, right? So you know, you could have something that you know liked as a kid, but you know, you watch it now and it just has no kind of like sentimental value of any kind to you. And then there's other stuff which you barely, you like, even as a kid you were like, this is so stupid, like this is dumb, you know, but for whatever reason that sticks with you and you're like, oh yeah, that thing or whatever. And so I was like thinking a lot about just the emotions involved here, because they're like powerful emotions. This concept of like nostalgia. I remember like the first time I felt nostalgia, and it was like I was a little kid kind of. It was like maybe aged 10, 9 or 10-ish, and we were singing in you know, music class. And you know, it was getting towards that part of the year where we're starting to sing Christmas songs. And I just remember having like this really like intense like feeling as a 10-year-old singing these songs in class and being like, oh, Christmas is coming. Like I have like these really strong feelings for this, reminds me of Christmas, this reminds me of other Christmas songs. I'm like, you know, Christmas is extremely steeped in nostalgia. But anyway, so forever I wasn't, I didn't really know if there was a story there besides I liked He-Man, you know what I mean? Like but then I found myself at I went to a toy convention that was like mobbed, this huge toy convention in PA. And it's like mobbed with people like buying old toys and selling old toys. And it occurred to me that like all these people are making their living based on advertising that was done in like 1982 to 1987. And like it's still paying dividends, right? Like because it's supporting all of these businesses at this convention, not to mention people like lining their homes with it. I talked to one guy who said that these collections we all have of our childhood toys are like the way pharaohs decorate their their tombs with like all their possessions and things like that. So we're like kind of building our own like little tombs, pharaoh's tomb to ourselves with these things. Yeah, so but it wasn't until I was like, all right, well, how did this like what exactly happened here with this advertising that was going on? And you know, that's when you realize that it was actually this stuff didn't happen until like 1982. Like it was, we protected children from this type of thing until that time when I was 2 and watching television. And then they were like, all right, we're pulling the rug out from under this. And now it's going to be full on commercials for children all the time. And you know, I don't think that we saw any of like the negative unintended consequences until like way later, when a lot of these people were actually like adults and kind of like doing kind of wild things in the name of Star Wars, right? You know, we see people acting like as like online mobs over the changing of minor details in Star Wars, racist mobs over Star Wars stuff. But it's not just Star Wars, you know, it happens in, you know, when they released the new He-Man and She-Ra, and it was like not, you know, masculine enough or whatever, and people, you know, a bunch of people lost their collective shit online, and you know, and you know, we see like it's so much more pronounced now, right? Like the amount of advertising and selling of nostalgia, right? All we see often, I mean, I hear people complain often enough about all the movies are sequels and reboots of old things and things like that. And you know, it started to occur to me, this concept of nostalgia, this thing that when I pick up a He-Man, I feel it like in my face and my nose, and like an actual physical feeling can be used to sell other things, and like is so powerful that it can be used to motivate individuals to do all kinds of things. And you know, that's when it kind of came together as like what this book was going to be about.
Yeah, because I mean, it's about He-Man, but it's also it's about advertising.
Yeah.
And especially about, okay, I kept thinking of two different things which are sort of related to this. One is sort of our parents' generation
Mm-hmm.
and how they grew up sort of as baby boomers, and the way that things like Davy Crockett
Yeah.
would suddenly show up and be insanely popular for a short period of time,
Mm-hmm.
as things continue to be.
Mm-hmm.
But there was no, it felt much more organic. Reading about it today, it's like, oh, this was a much more organic kind of craziness, and there was no infrastructure in place for
Right.
how
They
to
were kind of
monetize it immediately.
right. They're kind of like, you know, moving around in the dark and finding things that worked, you know.
Yeah, they were trying, this was still in the process of figuring out all of this out. But the other way I kept thinking of is the way that we often talk about social media today and children. And it's very much about these same kinds of conversations. What are we doing to children? What are we doing to children's brains? How are we bombarding them? What are the long-term effects of this? And in some ways, you're kind of arguing it ain't good, and it's not looking good. It's not looking any better.
I mean, you know, this is just, I was not, you know, going into the book being like, this is going to be all doom and gloom straight to the bottom. But, you know, I just kept this is what supported the, you know, the thesis was all these things that were happening. And it's the nature of capitalism, right? Like, things have to keep growing and growing, you know, nonstop, like forever. And it has to keep getting more bigger and badder, like WrestleMania 2, bigger, badder, better, you know. But you know, but the thing is like it's very personal to me, because this is it's about like my generation. You know, we were like the first children to experience this 24 hours, not 24 hours a day, but all children's programming being advertisements for toys. And you know, this was like the advent of cable and syndication and all this stuff. So there was like more advertising given towards children like than ever. And with regulations, you know, gone, it was, you know, a full force thing. And you know, it's like in my head, like I can't like get away from it. Like I made a mini comic about the same thing that before, you know, He-Man effect was even anything. But in the mini comic, it's called The Ghost of 1985, and it's like this ghost that like lives with you. And it's like your memories and this strong feeling of, you know, like safety and just like happiness. You know, what happens is like in your childhood, first of all, the things that happen in your childhood, right, are like get magnified and magnified over the course of your life. Like the first 10 years of your life, you know, is obviously monumentally influential on like the rest of your life, and it takes up a large part of your memory, because these are like your oldest memories that you're constantly remembering, and it's been with you for like the longest time. And but like we have like these ticking time bombs also like inside of us because of that, because some of our like most treasured memories have the Mattel brand on them. We now see these things as kind of like something else. It's part of our identity in a way, and for better or for worse, right? I mean, I don't know. I think there's a ton of people that are collectors and way into this. This is like, I'd be hard. It's difficult to be like, listen, this is hard. What you're doing is very bad. But because it's not really. I mean, it's the thing is that nostalgia is a human emotion that's been with us since time immemorial, right? Like, it's like laughter or sadness, whatever it is. It serves some sort of evolutionary thing to have this concept of emotion in us. So to say like it's folly to ever feel emotion, it would be like you should never laugh because there's people that tell mean jokes or something like that. Like, that's just not really a thing, and you're kind of missing out on something human that is like could be very extremely wonderful. I like it because it can be like this wonderful feeling of going back into your childhood and your life, but it's also such a strong motivating factor. Now that the people that went through this intense advertising are now older, in our 40s, we're seeing these same brands used to sell us all kinds of things, like all kinds of weird stuff. I got advertisements for really expensive sunglasses that look like stormtroopers. There's just because of the Barbie thing, like there's like these really expensive purses that have like the little Barbie brand on it. This is like powerful stuff, and that's why we're gonna see reboots and nonstop things like that forever, because it's easy. It's like a built-in fan base that's like for actually not just like a little bit into it, like part of your identity into the product. Like people that saw the Barbie movie coming out and they're like, oh, Barbie, like I love Barbie, like that gave me seeing the name and the logo and everything gives me this like feeling of just like that's who I am. That's an intense feeling. When I think about like the things that we turn over to commerce, like I think about healthcare, something maybe that shouldn't be run by capitalism because it's like too important, right? And when I think of something like nostalgia, which is like about building your identity and like your memories and some of your most precious memories, and for children and stuff, I start to think about maybe that is something that we should consider outside of the realm of capitalism. And we did for a very long time, like until 1982. Like we when they made the television, when they made regulations for TV, they made efforts to avoid this stuff, and then the Reagan administration, deregulated everything.
Yeah. Well, and part of this, because it's not just about nostalgia and it's not just about choice, it's about deregulation. It's about government. It's about there is that famous Lin Yutang line about what is patriotism but the love of the food one ate as a child.
Right.
And I use that because as you note, as you detail in the book, there is a very close link between government propagandists and advertising. And by close link, we mean these are the exact same people using the exact same skills and the exact same methods.
Yes, like entirely. Yeah, it's definitely, one of the most classic pieces of writing on nostalgia is Proust's days past.
Remember it.
Remembrance of Days Past. And I basically only really know about it because I know that it's mentioned in The Sopranos, where she talks about, he eats a Madeleine, a tea cookie, and he's suddenly sent right back to his childhood. And this also happens in Ratatouille, the movie Ratatouille. The critic at the end is like this harsh critic. He's gonna give everything like bad review, and then Ratatouille, the rat guy helps the chef make this dish, and the guy takes a bite and he's like sent straight back to his childhood, and he can like see his mother making it, and it's like this beautiful, actually he had come in from getting beat up by a bunch of kids or something, and his mom was giving him this comfort food, and it's that is it exactly. It's that's just in a bite of food. Like I was talking last night with Perry, an artist in Philly named Perry Shaw, about the same thing in music, and how he was talking specifically about Billy Joel, and he's like I don't like Billy Joel, like I'm not into Billy Joel, right? But sometimes Billy Joel comes on and I'm like taken back to my parents' living room in like 1987 or whatever it is, and he's like, I just want to listen to it, but I know I shouldn't listen to it, and I know it's bad, but I can't help it. And it's I think there's a lot of things like that too, where you can't there's part of you that knows that this is like not quality entertainment, the thing that you're looking at or listening to or reading. It's just like a bad version of everything, but for whatever reason you love it because it doesn't matter if it's terrible or if it's bad. It's like when I talk to people, so I have like a love of the television show Growing Pains, which is like this really like corny sitcom from like the 80s, right? Sometimes, but I was a kid when it was out, and I like loved it, right? And I still like it, and I watch it. But sometimes I tell people that were like in their 20s when that show came out, and they're like, that's the stupidest show like ever, like it's just the dumbest sitcom, and it's so it's the thing is that nostalgia like is not I mean, your memory is not really accurate, but your nostalgic memory especially is like very inaccurate. In terms of it happens in sports a lot. There'll be like an argument about who is the best. If you talk about when Mike Tyson was really like this famous boxer, it'd always be like, who is the best boxer, him or Ali? And it was not really about who you thought was technically better. It was about who you have this like emotional tie to. It happens in pro wrestling too, where people are like, no, the best wrestler of all time is nobody that's wrestling now. It was somebody that was wrestling 30 years ago when I was 12, and they're the best. So I think if you're unwilling to recognize that you are nostalgia is completely clouding your view, things can get pretty dangerous in terms of like what nostalgia can make you do, because it makes you think that things were great in a time period where you can look back and factually it just wasn't good for a lot of people.
Yeah. Well, there's that old saying in science fiction that the golden age of people will argue about the golden age of science fiction, and the rejoinder. A number of people have sort of it's been cited too, but someone said the golden age of science fiction is really 12 to 15.
Yeah.
And
Whenever
I think and I think that gets at, I mean, what you're talking about, and also like the heart of this book. I mean, it's about what it was, but it's about more than that. It's about the age at which we were exposed to something, and that feeling of novelty and excitement and that energy. And so some of this, like some of it's not even nostalgia that we're experiencing. It's we want to have that energy, that dopamine rush, that however you want to phrase it, we want to have that kind of sense again.
Mhm.
And of course, that's not possible.
Yeah, you can't go back.
Yeah. For
Even
so many
I always
reasons.
also say that even if you had a time machine and you did go back, it wouldn't be the thing that you're remembering.
Yeah.
It wouldn't feel that way because I think when I watch like old movies and stuff that I'm often thinking about, like, I remember watching this at my grandma's house when I was a kid, and like, oh man, I wish I was back there now, like watching it. My grandma's cooking and blah blah blah. Oh, it was so great, so wonderful. But at that time, when I was like 8 or 10, and like I was like bored out of my mind, and watching, G.I. Joe the movie for the 50th time, because I only had like 2 VHS tapes at my grandma's house. It was like, it's not like it was I was sitting there being like, oh, this is like so wonderful, I'm in such bliss because I'm watching this movie or whatever. But now in my memory, if I could go back and be there, it would feel blissful.
And of
But
course, now you have a laptop, you have how many DVDs, you have how
sure,
many streaming service, you can watch a million different things, but part of your mind always goes back to the crappy little television, the one of
yeah,
two things,
yeah,
you couldn't do
yeah,
anything else, so you watched this because
yeah,
your options were to do this or to lie on the couch and do nothing.
yeah, do nothing, or like go for a bike ride around the block again. Like, so we only had, it was a different time period,
Yeah.
completely.
And there's a way that it's like that's almost nostalgic. I mean, the idea that like you only showed, with very few exceptions, you only saw cartoons or children's programming on TV within these small certain periods of time,
Yeah,
or on Saturday mornings. Now you can watch whatever you want
anyone,
24/7.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, it was like, really, I mean, the idea of like just being, you had to be there at that moment to see
Yeah.
it, or you didn't see it.
Nothing got rerun. It was,
Yeah,
And I
I mean,
don't,
it did, but if you got lucky, you might see it again one day. But you couldn't predict when, like, I don't know, they're going to rerun this in 18 weeks. They're going to play this cartoon, this episode again.
you see, and I remember that, but I don't remember most of the shows that
Yeah.
I ever actually watched on a Saturday morning, but I
Uh-huh.
remember kind of the routine and the ritual of it with my
Yeah.
brother.
Hmm.
And we would get up early, and like, that was the time we were okay with getting up early then, as opposed
Yeah,
to
yeah.
going to school, and we would watch that, and we'd sit there and we'd have cereal, and
Cereal. Yeah, yeah.
we'd sit in the TV room and do, our parents wouldn't bother us for a while. I mean, it was
Yeah.
just, I remember that. I don't remember anything I actually watched.
Yeah. I remember there was stuff on like 3 channels. It was like they all had Saturday morning cartoons, and I remember being like, okay,
You had to flip through
yeah,
channels
like we're
every
watching this, and then at 10 o'clock we're going back to watch Alvin and the
Yeah.
Chipmunks, and then we're coming back to 2 at 11:30 to watch whatever that other show is, and then pro wrestling would come on.
And then at noon, the cartoons ended everywhere.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's so true, like that idea of like, if it catches you at like the right time and happens to be at the right, it stays with you. And like it stays forever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But as you were putting this book together and trying to figure it out, and how it was going to assemble it, I mean, I know you did you do a lot of like interviews? Were you talking to different people and just sort of
Yeah.
trying to put together what happened and sort of their responses to things?
Yeah, there was kind of like all kinds of, the book was going in like a million directions, right? Like, but like, I actually, when I was writing this out, like this was like the first time I really felt like I had like a thesis and what I wanted to say to support it and all these things. Like when I was writing it, I was like, it's, this, blah, 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 we get to this, and this, blah, blah, blah. So it kind of like wrote it out easily, but also like, He-Man doesn't appear in the book until like page 130 or something. He's not really in it that much, because it's so much deeper and richer than He-Man. Like that's like the entryway for me, but it was like so much more than that, and so much bigger than He-Man, you know.
Yeah, I mean, there's what is it, chapter 7, Frank Frazetta come Prince Valiant,
Yeah.
which was I had never thought of He-Man in those terms, but that's a effect. But I also keep thinking you had to call it the He-Man effect. I mean, you talk about your own personal response to things, but also He-Man is, not to denigrate any of the people who worked on it, but I mean, this is something that was a corporation went, we want to make something and we are going to engineer this product to get into the hands of children and drill it into their minds. And as one executive said, we were psychological terrorists in
Yeah.
selling this to children, which is
Right.
a terrifying. I mean, this isn't like someone like us or, Noam Chomsky saying this. This is one of the people who actually did this,
Yeah,
saying we were psychological terrorists.
We knew what we were doing at the time, and
and we did it to children. We weren't just like selling random folks. We're doing this to children. Like it's a little terrifying to think of.
Yeah, I mean, and I think the people that stood up to it, at the time, contemporaneously, like, were just seen as like killjoys, and what are you talking about? Like, who cares? It's just toys. It's just whatever. There's like this episode of The Simpsons where they kind of like parody it, where Marge is like trying to get them not to air Itchy and Scratchy. It's like a really early episode, and everybody, the press like hates Marge, the person who's like pointing out there's constant murder on Itchy and Scratchy, which is like clearly the least appropriate thing for children like in real life. But that's what these people were doing, actually, looking at this and being like, no, there's a problem, it's obvious, here's the studies, here's the psychiatrists, we have all this data to prove like children can't tell the difference between content and advertising. Like, it's classic manipulation. You'd be manipulating, they can't process it properly, all these things. And it was just like nobody in government was willing to give even part of a shit. Like the Reagan's FCC chair was just like, the television should be regulated the same way the toaster is. If it doesn't set your house on fire, there's nothing wrong with it, and so like let people do whatever they want. I mean, and that just happened, and it went on, and things rolled on and kept going. And I think we were just like, yeah, this is just how it is. There's just like, this is commerce, whatever. And so now, as like this 43-year-old person who's like still thinking about, like in the book, I have this drawing of a guy, it's on the back cover, of a guy that just has this thought of the arm of a He-Man. Here, I'll point it. And like, this is me, this is my brain. I have just like every once in a while I think about like ripping that arm off He-Man and like the feeling of that, and it's like in my brain, and it's been there forever, since I was like, all of my memory, since one of my first memories as a kid was being like 4 and playing at a playground, and my mom being like, we gotta go, you're gonna miss He-Man. And I was like, we better go, like freaking out, like. And that's one of my earliest memories, is that. I think that at some point over the last 40 years, people realized that advertising done as children pays dividends 20-30 years later. And if you're a big enough company that you're going to be around in 20-30 years, you can start making sure that you're making investments for the future today. And that's why I think, I see stuff all the time now, like, so they recently put out a new children's Star Wars TV show for like 3 or 4-year-olds. And the characters kind of look like the characters on Coco Melon, which is like a nursery rhyme show for like little kids. They have like these giant heads. And I'm watching that. I'm like, I know that this is because they know that like in 20 years that when they want to do another Star Wars movie, they can pull out this kid from this little kid TV show, and the kids that watch it are going to be like, oh, I love that guy. That's whatever the kid's name is. You know, and it's getting, it'll always, because of like the nature of capitalism and constant growth, like it's just going to keep getting more and more intense every year that goes by. And I don't know. I think it's like a runaway train at this point. Like, what do you do? I mean, what could you do? You know, I don't know.
And I kept thinking of all the toy makers, coming up with new lines and new different toys, and you've got to sell kids on the new version. I keep thinking of how everyone has discovered the multiverse in the past 5 years.
Yeah.
So now every Marvel and DC movie goes into the multiverse. So, ooh, there are three different Flashes, three different
Yeah.
Batmans, four different
Yep.
Spider-Man, seven different. I'm like, it's the same thing.
Yeah.
I mean, it really,
They figured
it's
out
the
how to
exact
sell
same kind of
sell
thing.
the same Batman with different outfits on.
Yeah,
You know,
that's true. We are already used to. I mean, it's essentially that. But
that's
yeah,
that was something they discovered. Like the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and Ghostbusters toys, which were like the second generation of this type of thing, really understood that aspect of it, where the He-Man, Transformers, GI Joe, they kept having more and more figures, and some of the ancillary characters that weren't on screen that much like didn't sell,
yeah.
whereas later on they figured out that they just could keep releasing the main people on the show in different outfits and it would sell just as much. So that's why you have like there's 100 different versions of like the main Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, like in different clothes. This is, whatever Hawaiian shirt Leo, and skateboarding Don, whatever it is, all that stuff. And that's because of the leftover stock of like the ancillary characters, like because Star Wars did that too, where it was, although Star Wars did release multiple versions of like figures and when they were wearing different outfits and things like that as well.
Well, and as you were working on the book and talking to people, I mean, were you talking to like Larry Hama and some of the
I did
comic
talk
book
to
people who
I did
were?
talk to Larry Hama and some of the GI Joe like writers. They're still, and Transformers writers, they're like still around.
Yeah.
And some of the people that worked at Hasbro and with the packaging and things like that. But like some of the most interesting people were like, I talked to this woman who I'm gonna forget her name, but she studies advertising and she's done all these things about advertising. And here it is, Jean Kilborn. Look up her stuff. Killing Us Softly, Advertising's Image of Women, and Can't Buy Me Love, How Advertising Changes the Way We Think and Feel. Those are like really good documentaries about like the way advertising works on us and all these underlying effects it has on us. And she has this great quote where it's like, when you see an ad, half of your brain looks at it, processes it, understands it at its surface level. The other half of your brain is contemplating what it really means forever. You're never not contemplating it. And so it's all about how advertising is powerful, and it does things to us that we don't know are going on. Like for instance, I talk about in the book, like in the 50s and 60s, television is presenting what people thought of as reality, but really it was like this distorted view of what reality actually was. But the influence, it became like a feedback loop where it was trying to depict this idealized version of reality, and the people were trying to make their lives look more like this idealized version of reality, like at home. Um, so, and that's, that can be, I think that's where a lot of the difficulties lie in like places like the suburbs and very keeping up with the Joneses type of thinking.
Yeah. But as you were talking, about this with people who worked on the shows and the comics, did they go, oh yeah, because you have a quote with one of them who says, why did people care that we killed these characters? Like, they were just toys. He's kind of like, they were toys. What was wrong with these kids?
Yeah, like they kind of, I think they were all when Optimus Prime died, right? In the Transformers the movie, they got a lot of bad reaction from
as
children.
They should have.
Sure.
As
yeah. Sure. Like they killed the main character of the show. And it's funny because there's I talk about in the book too, like when they were writing Transformers, they had kind of like this armchair psychology idea behind it that to make kids get interested in it, they had Optimus Prime be the character, a character type, the guy called Big Daddy, and that was like the main head guy that he protected everyone, and whatever, he had this fatherly figure and was written that way on purpose. And so then in the movie they kill the dad, they kill Big Daddy.
Also, for people who have not seen it or saw it.
Yeah, it happens very early in the film.
It happens at the beginning of the movie.
Yeah,
like that's what was so traumatic as a child. It's
like as soon as you get there. Because they had to get rid of all these old toys for the new toys. And that's I think another thing that they tried to improve on with the second generation. They didn't kill anybody. It would have been, Hawaiian shirt Optimus Prime, skateboard and Megatron.
So they didn't grasp what they were, they wanted to bring in new stuff.
Honestly, I remember as a kid going to see the Transformers movie and just thinking it was cool, because I thought it was like this badass movie because it was rated PG and they said like 2 swear words in it. Like I think they wanted to make it PG because they thought that parents wouldn't take their kids to see a G-rated movie. Meanwhile, my dad, I remember taking us to see this movie and he was like, I cannot believe I'm sitting through like going to the movies to watch a commercial for 2 hours.
And he was right.
Yeah, we probably were like begging him to go to Toys R Us right after the movie, and then
probably. So they just saw it as a joke. For them, this was just like a gig.
Yeah, I don't know. Like it's hard to say. Talk to some of them, they feel like they, this is also their lives' work in a way, and it's hard for them to be like, oh, this was just some bullshit. But some of them were for sure. That was just like some gig, or they just did, it's just like their work a day 9-to-5 job too. It wasn't like, in some ways they weren't really like taking ownership of the, be like, I created, this is my art that I'm doing. It was like, I'm just a cog in this wheel this is our products that we make, etc.
One thing I did want to talk about just before we get into the Q&A, because this is Barbie Oppenheimer weekend.
Sure.
But you kind of touch on this in the book, mentioning that in the 80s, the toy industry became gendered in a way that it wasn't previously. Which I guess I had never really considered, but also not being alive until. But and talk a little about that, because I think this is something that's probably surprising.
Yeah, it was interesting. So like there was this period of time in the 70s, I kind of think of it as like a golden era where there was a separation between children's TV and toys. So that's why like, the big TV cartoons and stuff from the 70s, like, Scooby-Doo or something like that. There's no like Scooby-Doo action figures from the 70s because like you couldn't do that at the time. And so like, there was like this kind of beautiful period of time in the 70s where you had imaginative play and all these other great things. And I'm sorry, what was the question exactly?
Well, kind of about the gender.
Oh, the gender thing. Right,
The
I'm
gender
sorry.
thing. Yeah.
Yeah. So in the 70s, it was starting to get a little bit better in that regard in terms of toys, where it was less about here's the army men for the boys and the dolls for the girls. Toys in the 70s were starting to get, you'd see in the advertisements, you'd see boys playing with the kitchen toys or the girls playing with the toy saw or whatever it was. Because it was like something was happening in the culture at the time, and they were like trying to break down a little bit of the gender stereotypes, right? It was kind of very proto, but they were moving in the right direction. And when the deregulation thing happened and they started really tying toys to television, they really became beholden to television demographics, and which were completely skewed, especially back then. It was like Gem and the Holograms and G.I. Joe. It's one is pink and one is, brown, and they, never the two shall meet. And it set everything back in a way, even though the toys were less gender specific, really. I mean, really, like a robot has no gender. Like, it's just like, but it became a boy's toy and whatever.
No, but it's true. And G.I. Joe and Transformers, they had female characters, as you know,
Right.
but they were very few and far between. And then
Mhm.
they were often sexualized in a weird
Mhm.
way.
Yeah.
I mean,
there's
as
like an
adults,
episode-
it's weird. I don't even think we
yeah,
understood
there's
what
like
it
an
meant then.
episode. When I was doing the research, I was like, there's this episode of G.I. Joe where one of the female characters is in a bikini for the whole episode. For the full 22
yeah.
minutes. And yeah, and you're like, dude, I mean, it says they drew the characters pretty realistically. I mean, in terms of like, whatever. And a lot of the way they drew women in all of the shows were a little bit suggestive. Yeah. But there was also not very good representation. There wasn't very many girls in the boys shows, and there wasn't, there'd be like one boy in the girl show. Also, like, it didn't have to be split. It didn't have to be, He-Man could have been. It could have been the He-Man and She-Ra show for everybody. You know what I'm saying? And then they came out with the She-Ra show, and they like completely blamed She-Ra for the end of He-Man, where they were like, "Oh, boys didn't want to play with the girls' toys. That was it. That's what happened." Meanwhile, just people got burned out because they were like nonstop being confronted with He-Man, and then new toys came out, and Nintendo came out, and whatever. It had nothing to do with the gender of She-Ra, but that's where they placed a lot of the blame.
They just blamed it on girls because
They
girls
kind of
have
did.
cooties, and the
In a
cooties
weird way.
infected the industry, and everything
Yes.
went to heck.
Yeah.
So Omar, I don't know. Do we have questions? Do people have thoughts they would like to interject to our conversation?
Yeah, looks like people have some questions. Let's see. Teresa says parents used to control what came in the house because one TV, one phone, one record player, children were exposed to different time periods. Do you think that now that they largely control what they consume is going to increase the effect of this advertising?
I don't know if it's because they have control over it, or if it's just because they're on it more often and can repeat it more easily. For instance, now like when in the 70s and the early 80s, you could go see Star Wars in the theater a few times, as many times as you want. But now you can watch Star Wars over and over again endlessly on your iPad, never stopping. And so like that access in that way is much more prevalent and efficient now. Yeah, definitely. In terms of like comparison to old media, for sure.
And some of it's also, sorry, not to, but I
No, go
mean, some
ahead.
of the thing we're talking about in the book, especially compared to today, is kind of there was more of a monoculture.
Yeah,
I mean, you
people were
couldn't get,
broadcasting.
yeah, I mean, all the things we're talking about, kind of the mass culture elements, like we don't have today.
Mm.
And not just because we don't have Toys R Us or other large scale toy stores where this would be playing out,
Right.
besides just on screen.
Paul also says, imagine if the Reagan era deregulation happened around the time the first Star Wars movies came out in 1977. How many more animated series and toys would there have been for that property, and the nostalgia perhaps even more deeply rooted than it already is?
Yeah, well, Star Wars is kind of like part of the reason deregulation happened was because it was so popular, and the movie was so people were going. I talked to a cartoonist named Durf about this, and he said he was a teenager when Star Wars came out, and he saw it 16 times the year that it came out. Um, uh, and, and so I think that then when the toys came out, it was so intense because people saw so much Star Wars all the time. But it did after that. Then they were like, we need media to sell these toys, and then it was like, oh, if we have this TV show, we could constantly do it. So I mean, if it happened earlier with Star Wars, yeah, it just would have been more and more and more than it is now. But you're right, because the Star Wars didn't get to the syndicated cartoon situation until kind of like the end of the Star Wars films. It was kind of like how they were keeping the property limping along after the films ended, because they did the Ewok cartoon and they did the Droids cartoon after the movies. But if the Ewok cartoon, well, they wouldn't have been Ewoks, but let's say the Droids cartoon came out right after the first Star Wars movie, yeah, I mean, there would have been more and more, it would have been even bigger than it was.
We would have had 12 Star Wars Christmas
Yeah.
specials. And wouldn't that have been a better world?
Teresa also asked, do you think we'll ever go back to the let's try it insane TV shows of the 70s, a la HR Puff and Stuff or the
And
Banana Splits?
I love HR Puff and Stuff. So like I feel like they kind of do a ton of weird stuff now, but it's not on television, it's on YouTube, right?
Yeah.
Like or if you think about like I can't remember their name now, but there's been weird kid shows where they're jumping up and down like that. But yeah, I mean, like we were saying before, things are so less, so much more niche now that there's just like room for all kinds of tons of weird stuff. But I mean, we're not really seeing a lot of weird stuff in the mainstream at all, but not really. Every once in a while something breaks through. It's a lot of homogenized stuff. And there's often not a lot of energy to push weird things, but once in a while something weird breaks into the mainstream, like something like Adventure Time, which is like one of like the weirdest things like in cartoons. Like it's so strange, but like it just became like this huge thing.
Yeah, and that also makes me think of stuff that I watched as a kid in the 90s. Things like Rocko's Modern Life or Ren and Stimpy is a classic example of that, where people will say, now that we're adults, we're like, oh my God, this stuff was really they're really talking about some really nasty stuff.
Yeah.
Just went over our heads.
Yeah.
Paul asks, does the book cover perhaps healthy or less detrimental ways to engage in nostalgia? If not, what are your thoughts? I think you guys covered that a little bit earlier.
Yeah, I mean, so like I have a quote that I read yesterday. And I think it talks a lot about like the good, like what the good parts of nostalgia are, and how like it's not all a bad thing. So this is there's a cartoonist named John Porcellino who sends out his comic in the form of like a zine every few months. And so you get it in the mail, and he includes like a little written little letter with it. And so in the last one, he talked a little bit about in the letter about this going over your old things and nostalgia, and I wanted to read it because it is like about how good things are, good nostalgia can be. So I'm more interested in investigating and nurturing all those things that have made me what I have become. Rather than seek out new records, I like to immerse myself in all the old music that gave me chills when I was young and that has lived with me ever since. My old beloved complicated friend John R. once wrote to me, "The older I get, the richer the chord of my life becomes. I spend my time living in the resonances. The chord grows richer, deeper, more complex, but at the same time, so much simpler." And, I think that's part of what it's not bad to like think about who you are and understand why you're here and how you came to be and things like that. But obviously, you have to, you can be, it can be used against you also. And I think it's just good to be aware of the power of it. Sometimes it's like, just stop and think, is this really that great? Or did I just like it when I was 12? And,
Mhm.
and, so you don't make bad decisions now based on, based on nostalgia.
Yeah.
Paul's asking how big is my toy collection. It used
Yeah.
to be bigger. I mean, it's gotten smaller since I had kids and we had less room in the house. But I have a lot of Battle Beasts, Muscle Men, and just I like to collect little things because they take up less room. So I like to get a lot of the miniature toys and stuff like that.
Yeah. Paul also wants to know, he said a great quotation from Porcelino's comic. What issue is that from?
It was the
you're
letter
trying-
that came with the most recent issue. So it wasn't
what
actually in
number?
an issue. It was number 80,
Okay.
came with issue 82.
Issue 82. Awesome. Great. So yeah, we'll close it out there. Yeah, Alex, is there anything else that you want to ask or say?
I have nothing to add. Just go buy the book.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I don't get a cut, so I'm saying this simply because it's a great book. So
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yes, really looking forward to reading the book and yeah, go out and buy it. Well, I put a link in the chat, but buy it wherever is best for you. And thank you so much. Thanks, Box, for joining us. Thanks, Alex, for acting as moderator tonight.
thanks for the invitation.
Thank you. Thank you so much for
Yeah.
having me.
Yeah, and thanks to our audience. Please join us at the museum for a tour or for another author program in the future. Have a great evening.
Have a
Thank
good
you.
night.
You too.